And remember to record. Thank you. I think we just had another person join, so I'm going to very quickly just drop that pretest in the chat one more time. If you've not grabbed that, to please do that. This helps us evaluate if our webinars are giving some new knowledge that people are able to walk away with. So it's a quick 5-question survey. Don't worry if you don't know the answers. You're not putting your name on it. We're not calling anybody out. And then you'll have those same 5 questions at the end of the session. So for those who might not know about us, if this is your first webinar, welcome. If this is your second 22nd webinar with us, welcome back. So we are Forum Families Forward. We are a family-led resource center in Northern Virginia. Our goal is to support foster, adoptive, and kinship families who are raising youth and young adults with special needs. We also provide trainings for the professionals that work with those families. So what do we offer? We have some free trainings like we are doing this evening. We do offer free consultations to families. So if, particularly after this webinar, if you're thinking to yourself, I have an IEP that's not meeting my kids' needs, you can fill out the contact form on our website and we will get back to you and set up a Zoom meeting and we can sit and go through that one-on-one with you. And that is free of charge to families. We have some events. We have a resource page so that you can find resources in the area. And we also offer some support groups. And we're going to talk a little bit about those in a minute. And then finally, we are the family partner to the Virginia Tiered Systems of Support. So working with the schools on that multi-tiered system, support system. So you are here in the third in our 4 webinar series. So there's one more FASD webinar coming up next Tuesday. Because you are here and you're already registered, you will get a reminder with the link for next week's. And that one we will be joined by Jessica Wilson. She's a licensed clinical social worker who is certified in both Florida and Virginia. And she's going to talk about understanding therapy options for FASD. Do you have to reside in Virginia to take advantage of the consultation services? We know Virginia best. So if it is for something outside of our state, I'm not sure how much information that we have for that. I will say particularly for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that you should check out FASD United's Family Navigators. They have people that are equipped to answer questions regarding other states. So I hope that helps, Sarah. If you, sorry, I'm going to have to pull this up real quick. For the other webinars, if you maybe were not able to join us for the first 2, we do have those recordings available, and I'm dropping in the chat right now the link. Actually, that's the link for today's slides. And here is the recording of the first 2 webinars. In case you missed those, you can get those recordings. Also, I forgot to add, if you are here today live, if you're watching us live in real time and need a certificate of attendance, I'm going to drop in here the email for Natalie Johnson Abbott. She is our administrative specialist, and she will get you a certificate of attendance after the fact. Unfortunately, if you're watching the recording, we cannot offer certificates for that. So a couple of the other things that we offer, we've got Learning Your Way. It is an online learning management system. We've got courses on there on special education. It's a go at your own pace. So you can hop in there. It's free to register and get in there. We've got things on special education, on trauma, other health impairments, positive parenting. So right now that system is closed down as we make some updates to it, but the registration will reopen on February 1st. And once you're in, we will just going to drop this in here to check the website for when that registration opens. Also, for those who are local to this Northern Virginia area, we have our Spring Forward Foster Adoptive and Kinship Family Fun Day coming up. And this is going to be Saturday, May 3rd. We've typically had it in April, but with the site, we were able to get May 3rd. So put that on your calendar. It's going to be a great day for the entire family. We've got programming for the youth. We've got childcare for the littles. We have programming for caregivers. We've got a great keynote lined up and some really great breakout sessions that we've been working on. And so it'll be a fun event for all. That's 8:30 to 2 at the Manassas GMU campus. We also are starting tomorrow our Stronger Together youth peer support group. This is in person in Fairfax. I'm going to drop that registration link there for you. It's going to meet for 8 weeks, and for young adults ages 14 to 22. We're going to meet 8 Wednesday nights from 6 to 7:30 starting tomorrow. It's clinician led. It is free of charge, and you can register for that if you have a young adult who could benefit from being part of that group. We also have our caregiver support groups, and I'll drop the link in here for this one. It's Form Families Together. It's for foster, adoptive, and kinship caregivers. We meet twice a month. The first Sunday is virtual. The third Wednesday is in person. So if you do live out of state, you're still welcome to come to that virtual session. Locals, though, might want to also consider coming to that in person. That's at our office in Fairfax. And this is it's a peer-to-peer group. So one of our trained FFF staff runs that group. She's phenomenal. And I put the link in there to register for that. Let's see.
Thank you, Stacia.
I'm going to let Kelly take it away.
Thanks so much. We have so much to share with you tonight, so we are going to keep a very quick pace. Stacia has a lot of things she's going to and has been chatting in, so please do take advantage of that. I want to draw extra attention to that Stronger Together youth and young adult peer support group that does start tomorrow. It's ideal if you're a child or if you are a young adult and are interested in that group. If you join for all 8 sessions, certainly you can join in a little bit later, but we hope that you take advantage of all 8 sessions. The registration, again, Stacia will link that in. It is in Fairfax. We serve a pizza dinner. It is led by clinicians, and we have a helper facilitator from GMU who's part of our partnership with Alpha Z Delta. So we're really thrilled to be able to bring this group for youth and young adults ages 14 to 22 available free of charge in person. So if you, your child, teen, young adult could benefit from some support, I think it's a really great creative group that's really focusing on building great connections and building, focusing on strengths to build strong connections. So the agenda tonight, as I said, is action-packed. We have a lot. So I just want to first say this is a passion of mine. Special education is a passion of mine. I'm Kelly Henderson. I didn't really say who I am. I'm Kelly Henderson, Executive Director of Forum Families Forward. And I am a special educator by training and by passion, lifelong special educator. And I love talking about special education. I know, though, that it may not be everybody's cup of tea. So thank you for submitting to this evening. And we will keep it certainly short. We will not go beyond 8 o'clock Eastern time. And we have a lot here, as you can see on the agenda. So I'm going to talk really fast. Know that you have access to the slides and you will have access to the recordings. We will send a link, a message with a link to that again tomorrow. So if you're missing anything, and as Stacia said, if you're struggling yourself with special education or feel like the services that your child is getting or are not getting are missing the mark, we are glad to set up a consultation with you. So what we're going to cover tonight is the challenge when FASD meets schools. We're going to talk more broadly about what state and federal policies guide the education of students with disabilities. We're going to talk about the special education cycle. We're going to apply that some to FASD. Some of it's just basic special education cycle stuff that you may be familiar with, but I really want to point out how certain applications may benefit children with FASD. We want to help you make it work for your child with FASD, including the use of FBAs and BIPs, and of course, more acronyms. And if you don't know what those are, don't worry. By the end of the night, you'll be singing our tune. And then resources for you and resources that you can share with the teachers in your life. Stacia is going to launch a poll so that we can get a little bit better sense of who's in here. It will help me know when to speed up my presentation and when to maybe slow down a little bit. So you should be able to answer that poll now. Oh, great response. That's great. Lots of people responding. Thank you so much. Give it just about 5 more seconds. And then, Stacia, I think you may be able to end the poll and share it, but it looks like, so we'll wrap that up. It looks like a lot of you have a child who has an IEP or 504 plan. So I expect that you are familiar with some of the language we're going to be talking about. It looks like just under half of you actually parent someone with an FASD. About a third of you work with somebody with FASD, I'm guessing as a professional, perhaps as a colleague too, who knows? And then another third or so, 30%, indicate that their children's teachers and providers don't really understand FASD. No one responded that their child could not get specialized services, but which is great news, So hopefully they're getting something. Okay, I'm gonna hit stop sharing. Here we go. So I just want to acknowledge, as Stacia said, we've had 2 webinars already in this series this month that really get into the nitty gritty of FASD and some of the challenges, the primary characteristics, the secondary characteristics. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Please do look at those webinars as well as webinars from past years and other resources that we will give you at the end of the webinar. But I want to talk specifically about sort of systems for just a moment, because special education is a systems level intervention at the grand scale. So our schools are institutions that have long-standing practices and mindsets about how kids behave and how they achieve, how they develop socially, emotionally. So special education is no exception to this. It's a system that's guided by many, many procedures, policies, protocols. And what we've learned about FASD and the research that has helped shape what we talked about earlier in the webinar series and what we try to focus on is a more progressive way of looking at neurobehavioral challenges. Sometimes our schools have not kept pace. So the fit for FASD into our educational system is sometimes a little awkward. It is not an easy fit. And as you'll learn, we don't have a category of disability that makes a child eligible for special education of FASD specifically. So there's sometimes a real mismatch. So I want to just acknowledge that and say, I'm going to talk about the way things sort of are, not the way things should be, and just give that a little space and recognition and acknowledge that some of you may have experienced some real frustrations. So what do teachers see when they are working with a child with FASD? Our traditional stereotype stern teacher appearance there. Often they see really challenging behaviors that challenge them to do their classroom teaching job. We see a lot of impulsivity. We see defiance. We see sometimes children that folks want to label with oppositional defiance disorder or conduct disorder. We see processing challenges, delays. We see disabilities, including learning disabilities. We see a lot of sensory challenges. Teachers report that these children often lie to them, make up things. There's a lot of social skills deficits. They often have trouble with boundaries, social boundaries, organizational boundaries, space boundaries. So lots of boundary issues that are age inappropriate. Poor decision making, and then immaturity. And we'll talk a little bit later, and I think you heard in previous webinars that we sometimes prefer to call this dysmaturity because that their maturity just doesn't quite sync up with the chronological age, but may be expected in a child who has prenatal alcohol exposure. So again, this is not a one-on-one on FASD. You have much better people doing that in webinars prior to this one. But in terms of school performance, what are the implications? Well, we know that primary disabilities that a teacher, school folks might see and might want to label are intellectual disabilities. Sometimes that is referred to as low intelligence or low IQ, impaired executive functioning, memory process and attention challenges, hyperactivity and impulsivity, speech and language difficulties, and official ADHD diagnosis. With those primary disability labels often come some secondary conditions, mental health conditions. And again, they sometimes see these terms like conduct disorder, depressive disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, difficulties in school that may include withdrawing from instruction, trying to escape instruction, eloping, cutting class, as well as disciplinary issues like suspension, big behavior issues, substance abuse issues, and employment challenges. So that gives you a little flavor of some of the soup that we sometimes see in the challenges when a child with FASD comes up in through a school system that's very structured and has their own systems that have been existing and procedures a very, very long time before the child joined them. Okay, so let's take just a real quick tour through special education and some of the other policies and procedures that guide children with specialized needs. I saw a lot of you have children with FASD, excuse me, some of you have children with FASD or are working with children with FASD, but a lot of you have had or do have a child with an IEP or a 504 plan. So this I'm going to go really quickly, but just very broadly, there are some important, critically important federal laws that have provided a backbone for the kinds of specialized services and specialized instruction that some children with disabilities, some children with other specialized needs need and can benefit from. Special education law and regulations are sort of the bulk of that we're going to talk about tonight, and that's IDEA, and we'll talk about what that means, and Section 504 and ADA. We love our alphabet soup. Privacy and confidentiality laws, also federal provisions. So FERPA is important because we talk about very sensitive topics when we're talking about children, particularly in foster care or kinship care, where they are not in a home with someone who's a parent, a adoptive or birth parent. And so we have to be really careful about guiding and protecting their information. There's a lot of general education standards, assessments, policies, and procedures. A lot of that varies state to state, but Title I and some other major provisions do cross state lines. And then locally, we are still in our school systems very locally driven. Our school boards set policies, they set a lot of formal procedures, and there's a lot of informal procedures that happen within schools. And so these are all the sort of the soup in which children with FASD must grow. 504, very briefly, this literally comes from section number 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So this is even before special education. And really the focus of this Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is to prohibit discrimination and on the basis of disability in programs that received federal funding. And they defined disability as physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And they'd list out in the regulations what those major life activities, and there's a long list. A couple of them are learning, communicating, concentrating, reading. So you can see that obviously the actions that are expected in schools, the behaviors that are expected in schools, are absolutely part of what goes into defining whether a child has a disability and deserves the protections of 504. Again, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this because we're going to really dive a little deeper into IDEA and special education. But 504 process, and often we talk about 504 plans, 504 plans, or 504 kid, which I resist, but nonetheless, those are sometimes the terms that we hear. A referral starts the process. And a local screening committee meets in some way, shape, or form. And there's a lot of variation in how that looks school to school, state to state. But just know that there is an actual referral to make a child come to the attention of school personnel who may have one of those major life impairments and needs the protections, the disability discrimination protections. And then once the child is determined eligible through that referral process, a knowledgeable committee meets and they typically create a plan for education, related aids and services. And that plan should be reviewed annually. There are procedural safeguards that do apply. Just a little bit more on 504 under that 504 funnel. 504 was superseded in a sense by the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, in 1990, which extended the protections of 504, which again were in federally funded programs, applied to federally publicly funded programs. And ADA applied it to a much wider set of circumstances and settings. And in 2008, specifically, there were amendments to that 1990 Act, and the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education enforces 504 and enforces these amendments to the ADA. And there was new guidance that was very clear in my non-attorney position that the ADA and 504 can apply to quite a wide class of persons with disabilities. And so most important is the second bullet on this page. If you are raising a child or working with a child who you're struggling to get services for, and they keep saying, you're being told that a child who is doing well in school, is getting good grades, and is achieving in school cannot possibly need 504 protections and cannot possibly need an IEP. Just know that these amendments in 2008 were very clear that academic success does not necessarily disqualify a student from being identified with a disability. And we could spend a whole hour on this set of guidance. But I just want to raise that very clearly, that if your child is succeeding academically, meaning bringing home academic grades that are passing or above, and you're being told that, of course, they don't need any additional supports and services because they're doing just fine, there is some standing for making sure that their disability needs are met if indeed they do have a major life impairment. So again, can talk to you about that all offline, but I want to make that really clear. We're going to move quickly into IDEA. And again, this is sort of synonymous with special education. IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, guarantees, this was actually originally not under the same language. The first act was called the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, but 1975, so a couple years after the Rehabilitation Act of 73. And it has had a couple iterations. The most recent has been called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act broadly. And it guarantees specially designed instruction is available to an eligible child with a disability. And that is the language, child with a disability. And that specially designed instruction is provided at no cost to the family. And it is designed to meet the unique needs of the child with a disability. And that means it is indeed that first word, individuals, individualized instruction and set of services. And so that's really important. This is a game changer for children with disabilities. These are the legal foundations. I think Stacia is going to kindly chat these links in so you can click right on them. There's a federal law. The last time it was reauthorized fully was 2004. There are state regulations that implement the special education law. Those state special education regulations, whatever state you're in, if you're in Virginia, we're going to give you that set. They should become your best friend because there is so much juicy information in there, lots of procedures and policies. and guarantees rights and responsibilities in there that is really important to get to know that. There's also a little easier to read special education guide that the Virginia Department of Education has just recently, it's called a family guide, recently released in the last couple of years, and that is a little easier read, but both of these pieces of guidance are important, the regulations and the guide. Again, the guarantee of IDEA is that a child with a disability will receive a free appropriate education for all children with disabilities. And so you'll sometimes hear this word FAPE, and that's really where that came from, free appropriate, it's a public education for all children who have disabilities. Placement in the least restrictive environment, and that simply means that your child is receiving services in an environment with non-disabled peers as much as possible. And there are protection for the rights of children and their parents, and parents are expected to be participants in educational planning. I highlighted those words in green, parent and parent, because that is the word that is used in the IDEA regulation and statute. I want to be clear that there's also a definition of parent that we, again, aren't going to take the time to go into tonight, that does make provision for foster parents, parents who are fostering their children, and kinship caregivers. So we can have a whole definition and discussion on definition, but please know that when we say parent, when the law says parent, they mean you as educational decision makers, whether you're a kinship caregiver, foster parent, or adoptive parent. Here's the special education cycle. And it starts, and it is a cycle because periodically we have to revisit decisions that were made in the past, but it starts with referral, goes to evaluation, eligibility, an IEP, individualized education program is developed, instruction and monitoring, and then at least an annual review of the IEP. How is that instruction? How is that achievement, movement towards the goals coming? And then periodically there will be an opportunity for reevaluation. I'm going to talk specific to FASD about referral. So this is if you have some concerns about your child, if you suspect that they or know that they have prenatal alcohol exposure, and you have concerns about their behavior, their academic performance, their social emotional well-being in school, then refer them to special education through a system. And it can take just a few minutes. It's a formal notification to the school that your child is experiencing learning or developmental disabilities, and that you believe that they may be a child with a disability. And you are asking the school in that referral to evaluate them for early intervention if they're young, or special education related services if they're older. A referral can be made by a family member. It can be made by a teacher, or really any other individual who's involved in the life of that child. So I want to say that again, you as a parent, caregiver, you as a concerned professional can make the referral to the school to say, I believe that this child is a child with a disability, or I have reason to believe that they may be a child with a disability that meets the definition of the law. I encourage very strongly that be a written request. You can say something to a AP or a special education chair, but follow it up in writing. That could be an email. Sometimes school systems have forms, and they will ask you when you make their request to then complete a form, and that's fine. So when you are referring, you want to be really, really clear about your concern. And this is where, if you have reason to believe that there was prenatal alcohol exposure, or other exposures, or other issues prenatally or since birth, that you have concerns about, you definitely want to state them very clearly in the referral. You want to describe what has been tried to your understanding with the child. And again, if you're a professional, you likely have access to a lot of record on what has been tried, screening information and other interventions that has been tried. And then include any information about how often those things have been tried, how long those efforts have lasted, and what were the result of those. Families, if you have private evaluations or assessments, and that could be educational specific, or it could even be social emotional, psychosocial, social cultural. You have the option of sharing those records with the school system, but you do not have an obligation to. That is a choice that you can make. So again, the process continues around, and we proceed hopefully in a case where the screening team believes that it's merited. We proceed on to an evaluation. And just a couple provisions there. I want to point out the evaluation is conducted at no cost to the family. Never at any time should you, as a family member, be asked to pay for an evaluation, pay for pieces of an evaluation, or even, to be honest, pay for even a medical exam if the team recommends that. And when that evaluation is complete, and there's a whole set of procedures and rules and regulations about what that evaluation procedure should be. Parents, caregivers are members of the team who review that evaluation data, decide whether more information is needed, and then when they believe they have enough information, they make a determination about eligibility. I want to just mention before we jump into eligibility, this provision that is often not particularly well clarified in some schools. It is in the procedural.
Oh my gosh, it's so pink. It's so
procedural
cute.
Safeguards notice. Stacia, you want to just try to mute that? Thank you. Just want to be really, really clear that you have a right as a parent or caregiver to disagree with a test or tests that a child was given during their educational evaluation process. And you may request an independent educational evaluation, again, acronym IEE, that is conducted by someone outside, an independent person outside of the school system. It does not work for the school system. And we have found that for children with FASD, these outside educational evaluations are extremely important and extremely telling. So I just want to raise that. We can talk about that in Q&A if we have time. And of course, there's lots of information on our website about IEEs and how to proceed with that. Generally, the school system should be paying for that independent educational evaluation. And so they often provide a list of evaluators that they work with, but that you should not feel limited to that list. If you have good reason to believe that a particular evaluator would be well suited, for example, has experience with FASD, you can request that provider. Okay, so I'm going to move on. We've evaluated, and the next step is eligibility. And this is really tricky grounds for individuals with FASD. One of the challenges in special education, because of all of these procedures and processes and rules and regulations, is it's a very categorical system. So eligibility to receive special education related services under IDA is provided to those children who have a disability and fit under one or more categories. And the feds determine what those categories are. There are 14 of them. And the task of the eligibility team, including the parent caregiver, is to determine which categories, and there could be more than one, that a child would be eligible for. And there on the slide and in your regulations, you can find a definition of each of those 14 categories in Virginia regulations. And if you're out of the state, you'll find similar in your state regulations. The team must go through the criteria for those categories in which the child may be considered eligible, being considered for eligibility. The disability must also adversely impact educational performance. And that is sometimes where we get into harkening back to that language that we saw in the ADA amendments, that educational performance is not just grades, And in addition to being identified as in one of the categories and having an adverse impact on educational performance, the child has to need specialized instruction and related services. So those two words, specialized instruction, is really the critical phrase to really deeply understand special education. This is the distinguishing factor in some regards from 504 plans, where there was a focus on accommodating and modifying to make sure that the disability discrimination is not occurring. In special education, the child has a disability adversely affecting their performance, fits under a category, and they need specialized instruction. They don't need just more time to do the work. They may not need just breaks as they are working towards a task, but they actually need something different. The instruction must be adapted in some way. Here are those categories. So I'll give a moment to just reflect on that list. And what is highlighted here in green are the categories we most often see children with FASD identified under for special education purposes. Okay, so we know that oftentimes FASD co-occurs with other disabilities. Often we see other health impairment used because the child likely, in many cases, has already had a diagnosis outside of schools with something like ADHD or ADHD-like characteristics. A child with FASD alone, I want to be really clear, a child with FASD alone can still qualify under other health impairment if they meet the criteria. They do not need to have an ADHD diagnosis to qualify under other health impairment. Other health impairment is a big umbrella category. So just know that. However, often we know that many children with FASD have been identified with ADHD or ADHD-like characteristics. Autism also co-occurs with a lot, is also a neurodevelopmental disorder, and the developmental disorder that can coincide with FASD. Developmental delay is often used for our little ones before there is recognition maybe that there's FASD and or before there's recognition of other disability categories. In Virginia, that category, developmental delay, can only be used through the year that the child is turning, the school year that in which the child is turning 6. In other states, that varies. Emotional disability is often used, and intellectual disability may, again, you would have to have the impaired cognitive functioning to qualify for intellectual disability, but for some children with FASD, they also will qualify as intellectually having an intellectual disability. Traumatic brain injury can be used. It's a little trickier because of the nature of the injury and when that injury to the brain occurs. So I just want to highlight that these are the ones we often see in a child with prenatal alcohol exposure. Notice, of course, there is no FASD category. Some states, California most recently, has actually named FASD under the list of possible conditions that could qualify a child with another health impairment. So do know that you may see that language, not in Virginia, but in some states you may see the words fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or prenatal alcohol exposure under the definition as an example of OHI broadly. This is an example of a local school system here in Northern Virginia and the eligibility worksheet for the emotional disability. I mentioned that there are criteria, and this is literally what the team, including parent caregiver, has to do is go through the worksheet and identify this definition is clarified very clearly in the worksheet, and each step the team is to discuss each step and make sure that all of the criteria are met, and not only the definition of emotional disability, but again, the adverse educational performance and the need for specialized instruction. So hopefully that's really clear. Again, not all school systems have a worksheet quite this explicit, but there has to be discussion of the characteristics as defined. All right, so Stacia, I think it's time for our second poll to just get, now that we've talked about those categories. Hopefully it'll be popping up anytime. You can, I think, hopefully you can mark more than one category because you may have children in your life that have more than one.
Sorry, it is telling me it has already launched.
Okay, that's okay.
I have to hit. Here we go.
There we go. Perfect. I see a couple others. So anybody who's marking other, please do chat in if you are willing. Chat in what categories your child has been identified, or the child of your focus has been identified with, because I'm curious about that. Thanks for doing that. We'll give a little bit more time. I know that this you may have to be running back from feeding a child dinner, so run back to the computer to click a button. We'll give it just a moment more. Thanks for responding. So many of you are hanging with us tonight. Looks like learning disabilities at this point is the top vote getter so far. More than half of you have a child in your care who has been identified with learning disabilities. And then the next highest, Stacey, you can go ahead and share if you'd like, developmental delay and other health impairments, as we talked about. That other health impairment is that umbrella category under which a lot of kids with FASD have been identified.
We have two, Kelly, who shared that. For the other, it was TBI.
Oh,
so
okay.
Traumatic brain injury and speech was the other one that
good. Okay, good. And that is often one of the first things we see as a child grows up. So thanks, everyone. That was awesome. Thanks for doing that. So as you can see, it's not a straight shot for our kiddos with FASD. So I just put I think judging by the first poll, I'm not going to need to talk about the importance of using a label, even though it's sometimes very off-putting. So we're going to move on to that to further around the cycle, and that's the IEP. And this is I think what we preach every day at Forum Families Forward is the importance of really knowing that IEP and leveraging the IEP to the advantage of your child. So we're going to talk just briefly. Again, this is not, we have a whole webinar that we just did this fall on strengthen the IEP. Our colleague Renee did a fabulous job on making your IEP like the best possible. And so that is also on our website. But just a reminder that two things. First of all, the P in IEP, this is one of my little pet peeves. Often people will say IEP, Individualized Education Plan, and it is actually a program. It's program federally and it's program in Virginia. I know some states may waffle a little bit on that. I really feel strongly that that word program is really indicative of what IEPs should be. It should not just be a plan like, oh, let's set some goals out there and hope it's going to work and check back in a year. It really is a program of services. It includes goals. It includes an approach for measuring progress, but it also includes services. It includes a program of services as well as related services, specialized instruction, modifications that may be needed, detailed information about how children are participating in assessments, with whom they're participating. Are they with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate? And what, for our kiddos in Virginia, at least age 14 and above, specific transition services, supports and services for our kiddos who are going to be aging out of school and aging out of disability support systems that are designed for children and into adult worlds. So this is a big package. I see and have participated in IEPs where they're talking 40 to 50 pages of stuff. And so it's really important that you know what's in there and that you feel good about this being the program of supports and services that are going to help your child. And this is the opportunity when you have a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder to really lay it on the line. I want to just make a note on that present level. We call generally up here in Northern Virginia, at least, the PLOP, the present level of performance. In your neck of the woods, you might call it PLAF. It's the same thing. We're talking about the present level of the performance of the child. Wanted just to make a tip of the hat to the related services. This is the list that comes from the regulations. It's a long list. It may be that you've never seen some of these things or had a discussion around some of these related services in your IEP meetings, and that's not unusual. Often it's very rote and it's a very quick conversation, and often maximally it may talk about speech for younger kids, and it may talk about OT or PT. And that's typically the extent for in many families' experience of the conversation about related service. I want to just raise the awareness that there's a whole list here. And for kids with FASD, some of these services may be very critical to helping a child be positioned to meet their goals, the goals that are set by the team in the IEP. So take it all in. Give it a little thought, and we can have more conversation. Again, we have a whole webinar specifically focused on IEPs, and we talk a little bit more detail about that. But these can be really critical services. Again, often not voluntarily offered in a typical run-of-the-mill IEP meeting, but you have in your child with a FASD, not a typically run-of-the-mill child. So just know that these are things to ponder.
Kelly, we have a real quick question related to what you were just talking about. At what age should the transition assessment be completed? They should start talking about transition at
14.
14
minimally.
Okay.
Minimally 14. And it really should be in Virginia the year of the IEP where the kid will turn 14. So it should be a middle school conversation. Now, I will say if you're not in Virginia, it can range up to 16. The federal regulations require it at least by 16, but many states start younger. And I think there are a couple states that start even younger than 14. So you should be having that conversation. Okay, so behavior is often where we hit the rubber hits the road with FASD, is where we begin to really have some mismatches in programming for special education and the challenging behaviors that the child is exhibiting. So I really like this quote that says we have to take a two-prong approach. And this article is on our website if you want to look at it. But it's sort of a classic piece of literature on FASD. In light of the multiple risks often experienced by children with FASD, designing effective interventions may be challenging. Interventions that seek to both remediate primary deficits, and again, we've talked a lot about those primary deficits in other webinars, and mitigate the various environmental liabilities that often accompany a history of prenatal alcohol exposure may yield the most positive outcomes and results. So I think this is really important, that we need services that address the core challenge, and we need to working directly with the child, specialized instruction, specialized interventions, those related services. And we need to also be adjusting the environment, the setting around the child. And that combination broadly is what's going to get us the biggest bang and biggest effect for our kiddo. Okay, so I'm going to just move on. Just talk, because again, this is the IP in our cycle. The IP is where we're beginning to talk about these instructional pieces, these programming pieces. So this is just an example, again, from another piece of literature, also on our website, that really talks about sort of what's the neurobehavioral challenge, and then what are those environmental modifications. And I'm not going to take time to read that for you, but know that every challenge should have a reciprocal potential environmental modification, or more than one. So again, not just, controlling the impulse for the kid and helping, with instruction and services to manage the impulse, but really what can we do in the environment? What can we do in the setup of the environment to minimize the impact of that impulsivity? So, lots and lots and lots of accommodations and modifications. These are just some of them. And what's important with our FASD kiddos, if you're living with one, you know you are thinking outside of the box all the time. And it's important to be part of the team and get the team also helping to think outside the box and supporting that outside of the box thinking. Some of these are not surprising, and some, really may need some consideration and may, in fact, cause a little bit of like, I'm not sure we can put that in the IEP. The answer is yes. Yes, you can. Yes, you can put it in the IEP if the team agrees that this is necessary and it applies to an annual goal, and is as validated by a present level of performance statement. So just some things, it's not uncommon to say flexible seating, that we're going to put the child near the teacher, and that's fine. That's great. Things like providing prompt feedback on tasks when completed well. That's a behavioral intervention. That's a reaction, a response of a teacher. And that may not typically be on the IEP, but it could be an accommodation or modification. So just thinking about what the child needs and thinking about how to get that formalized in the IEP. So some opportunities, whether it's a 504 plan or an IP, there is that present level of performance, or like I said, PLAF statement. And this is an opportunity, a window for you as a parent or caregiver or advocate to really enter some critical information into the record. So when you're talking about Anita and her challenges, you can actually say, due to limitations in Anita's working memory related to her FASD, Anita's ability to rote recall more than 10 multiplication facts is seriously limited. Okay, we know that Anita's struggling with rote multiplication recall. We also know, because of the way this is written in this present level, that we have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and that it's impacting her working memory. So you've got a lot in that present level of performance statement. So that kind of thing might be helpful to you if you're finding that you're having a hard time getting the big picture across and getting some of your concerns documented. Those kinds of present level of performance statements may be helpful. And then obviously, for every goal, there should be a present level of performance that's specific to that goal area. So we really need to spend some time thinking about that present level of performance and how it relates to the goal or goals that are being created. Just again, more opportunities. Goals and objectives can speak to things that are non-academic. I am sure that hopefully is not new news to you, but goals can, again, speak to those areas that are non-academic directly: social skills, behavior, sustained attention, executive functioning. Using trauma-sensitive lens as we think about our goals and objectives. And we have a whole training on that as well, and some wonderful videos and materials about really thinking about special education and thinking about that intersection between trauma and disability. And then stating those accommodations and program modifications. That's a section of the IEP. So really thinking about what accommodations are going to be supportive of the goals that the team has agreed in. And this is where functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plans come in, which we are going to get to momentarily. I just want to give a nod to, oh gosh, we are really tight on time, aren't we? Okay, so just a nod to our previous webinars that have talked specifically about interventions that have an evidence base for FASD. We don't have time to do that here. Know that they are available. This is Dr. Amali Malayans, who did a webinar for us last year. It's recorded. Slides are available. You can learn about all of these and even more. All right. I am going to do 3 minutes on FBAs and BIPs, and then refer you to our slides and to a webinar that we did earlier this fall, not specific to FASD, but on behavior assessments and functional behavior plans. Functional behavior assessments and behavior interventions plans. It is really important that when a child is struggling to be successful in a classroom with behavior, then it's time. It's time to really get to the nitty-gritty of the why of the behaviors. We really resist at FFF the word problem behavior. We want to think less about what's happening on the blue side of this screen. Terms like he's hyperactive. he's a liar, he torments, he's disruptive. And we want to really get to the very descriptive, observable descriptions of the behavior, what's happening. And an FBA helps us do that. The FBA is a team-based process. It is considered the gold standard for really getting to individualized behavior interventions and supports. And the key here is that term function. We know that problem behaviors, behaviors of concern, serve a function for the child. Sometimes we can nail that function down really clearly. They want attention, they want to avoid something, they're seeking approval, they're seeking peer contact, they're trying to escape something. But often, particularly with the kids with FASD and neurobehavioral and neurodevelopmental disorders, that's a little bit harder to suss out. It's not as obvious. It's not a straight line. So want to point out that we have, and I think Stacia's going to include the link to this FBA guidance Virginia has had for now almost 10 years, and a new one is pending any time now. But for now, we have this FBA guidance that provides you a lot of information about what an FBA should be. But essentially, it's a two-step deal. Assess the behavior, understand the why behind the behavior, then create a behavior intervention plan that uses that discovered function to really create a better way forward. So let me just do a real, you're going to, if in an FBA process, you will have both direct and indirect assessments. Direct is where they're looking at your kid, they're looking at the scenario, they're watching what the child does. They're watching what other people around the child do. What's reinforcing to that child? What is the function, the outcome? What's maintaining that behavior? And indirect, where they talk with the teacher or others who are working with the child, and hopefully they're talking also with the parents and family members. This is really what a good FBA hypothesis ends up looking like. You have a chain. And that chain starts in the middle with that problem behavior, really understanding that problem behavior, really getting to the visible, observable description. How frequently is the behavior? How intense is the behavior? How long is the behavior lasting? Understanding the behavior. That's why that says number one, because you start there. Then you think, what happened right before that behavior? And we call that an antecedent. And what happened right after it? So we really want to understand the behavior, what triggered that behavior, what then maintained that consequence of acting out, running out of the room, tearing up a paper. And then we have setting events, which is our last thing that we look at, but very, very important in the functional behavior assessment chain. All right. I am going to just tell you that we have so many good slides here to look at all of those stages. The takeaway, I hope, is that if you are struggling with challenging behaviors, your child is struggling with challenging behaviors, and you're getting the phone calls, and you're getting the we've got a problem, and your child has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or is suspected to have a neurodevelopmental disorder like that, it is really important to get behind the behavior, understand the function of the behavior, and notice here on the right-hand side, we have the common ones: attention seeking, stimulus, sensory seeking, escaping or avoiding something. Safety is huge. Safety is one function, the seeking of safety. And for our trauma-exposed kids, this is huge. For our kids who have had prenatal exposure, safety is a major factor in how they approach their interactions with school, with humans, with everything in their life. So it's really important to bring that piece into the conversation about functions being served. And I am going to encourage you to then, once that functional behavior assessment is done, to then really drill into a behavior intervention plan. And the team, again, includes you as that functional behavior assessment information is used to create a behavior intervention plan. We have a lot of resources, so many resources about FASD, as well as, oh, and I do want to point out, if this is just the tip of the iceberg for you and you're like beginning to say, I really need some more supports, I do want to acknowledge there are some private providers that are experts that hang out their shingle and are available, again, usually on a fee basis to support individual families in understanding and moving through the process specific to education. So I do want to acknowledge those folks. And you again will have links to those. And then lots and lots of free resources on special education, as well as functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. We do have a post-test. We do have an evaluation.
I just dropped those 2 links in the chat for both the post-test and the evaluation. I did want to add too, as a parent, when you're thinking about the function of behavior, that is a space where you can really add what you understand about FASD. So for example, my son acting out in the cafeteria, they may determine that that's attention-seeking behavior. But what I understand about that behavior is he doesn't have the social skills to know how to engage in conversations with those he's sitting with. And so that looks like attention-seeking, but what it really is a skill deficit for him. And so you want to make sure that you get your input in there, because if we went with just attention seeking, then there would be they'd be consequencing that behavior out of him or trying to find a way to do more positive attention seeking, when really what he needs is somebody to help him build social skills so that he can interact in that setting. So it's really important to share your knowledge and understanding of FASD and how that comes to play as they're looking at those functions and other aspects of IEPs. Were there other questions?